Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venne.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Constantin Limberakis, who's the founder and president of Liberis Consulting. Welcome, Constantine.
Thank you, Ulf, for having me on your show.
So before we start the show, why don't you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. So as Ulf mentioned, I'm Constantine. I have been in the procurement supply chain space for about 20 plus years in a variety of roles in consulting, as an analyst, and also in product marketing roles with a variety of technology companies in the space.
Cool. So how did you actually get into supply chain management in the first place?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I think it goes into the evolution of the career that started in technology by way of Arthur Andersen Consulting. So when I first started my foothold there, I got into technology implementation work and I started in ERP. So enterprise resource planning. It was the hottest thing in the mid to late 90s. Everybody was excited about it. And then we started seeing the evolution of other technologies taking shape. And I really got into the whole e-procurement space, and that by way of procurement, sourcing, that led me more into supply chain and how the development's there. So that just kind of evolved as I got into different places within consulting and then into the analyst world. And it's just something I've always been fascinated in learning more about, every year that I've been in the industry.
Yeah, and I think that's already the next question that I have, because
Mm-hmm.
if I look at the history that you kind of have, it's very procurement focused, obviously some supply chain elements, but there's a clear tendency. You seem to like procurement a lot, frankly. So what is it about procurement that really fascinates you?
Well, it was the entry point again into I think you and I had been talking about the idea of things like Ariba that came out of the world, right? So I think what was going on is people didn't even think about what procurement was. And I remember teaching these classes actually on site in Sunnyvale when they had some strategic partners that they were trying to get the word out, like e-procurement, everything that's going to be online. There's catalogs, there's marketplaces now that you can use with the internet. And so that kind of took shape. That just started fascinating me. And I think that the junction, I would say the point where the junction with procurement and supply chain is with supplier management. I find that space so fascinating because, for every buyer, there's a supplier and this relationship on the network. The networks where the big talk, these multi, enterprise networks, how are these things taking shape? We're still talking about them. Are they industry focused? Are they buyer supplier focused? Is it indirect? Is it direct? And so that I think is really part of the reason why I focused on that. And part of it was because I was covering it as an analyst at Aberdeen. So that was by way of my role. So yeah, but that's kind of how it evolved.
Interesting. And I think it's still not fully figured out, right? In the end, the
No.
whole network to network marketplace is still work in progress, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. And even the function between procurement and supply chain, because a lot of times when you talk supply chain, people assume logistics, distribution, manufacturing. And if you look at the whole life cycle of supply chain, it's got to start with some kind of sourcing element, procurement. So the upstream, downstream conversation, always there. But when you go to conferences and practitioners, I think you sometimes still see that distinction. And we have to bring it together a little bit more, I think, at least from what I've seen.
And that's why this podcast is called Supply Chain Pioneers, and we cover all of it. So good. So as you already talked about Ariba, there was a rise of procurement solutions. And
Yeah.
during that time, actually, you were the co-founder and very instrumental to the marketing for Shelby Group. And Shelby Group was focused on implementing software and making it work, which is quite important, obviously, to drive
Yeah.
value. So when I see your later work, especially in marketing, you always seem very focused on this trust and the ability to serve. So making it work. Is that something as a marketeer that you took away from that time, or how did that happen?
Well, it's interesting that again, because I started on the consulting side, you're always trying to get the client to make sure that they can best leverage the solution and get what the solution provider promised. So I now became more on the inverse side of that to say, well, what are the product developers and the people that are actually making the software trying to do to make sure that they have the right customers? So the consultants always kind of sit in that in between, and so it was very fascinating for me to see, well, how do you make the widget? How do you make this to make sure that the consultants then have something viable that they can sell with their services and then promote? So it's this ecosystem of trust that you're trying to build. And I think too often, sometimes the software providers, they might oversell. The consultants are supposed to be the arbiters of truth, but then you have these nuances of relationships that can kind of take these things out of whack. So when I was at Shelby, we did a big thing of Ariba. We were trying to get that ecosystem out there. And a lot of times what we would do is we would beat out the Ariba consultants themselves because we were the independents that were implementing the solution. And then seeing what it looks like underneath the covers to say, well, how do these solutions really work? How are they developed? That was just kind of a fascinating transition for me.
Yeah. And also talking about fascinating transitions. What a segue. You will see in a second. So you have transitioned in your career back and forth between different roles, especially product marketing and then also being a analyst or doing market research for Hackett Group and many others. So
Yeah.
why do you think that went so seamlessly in your career? What are some of your key characteristics in making this work?
Well, I see the level of influence that when you're an analyst, there's a certain level of kind of presumption there. There's like, okay, this person knows the space, you understand the trends. I've always been fascinated with that. And then when you go back and say, well, I can provide you insights, Mr. Software Provider, that you need to know on the flip side, right? And I think that transition's a natural one because you're looking for understanding the customer, you're looking at innovation, you want to try to influence to say, well, what kind of influence can I have for the software makers that then need to know, well, what is it that they're hearing? And you're kind of that echo chamber. So I really feel that the product marketing role, I wouldn't even call it the marketing, but the product marketing role, that evangelist role within an organization has a direct line to the analysts. So it's almost like this foreplay of back and forth that you always have to be aware of. And I think it's a natural transition. If you look at others in my background, you see a similar role change. And sometimes they go back to product marketing or product strategy. And then sometimes they go into the analyst world. So I find that kind of a seamless transition. But again, obviously you play a different function in the market, but it seems to be kind of more of a seamless aspect because of playing similar roles, but in some way, in many ways, it's very different, right?
Yeah. Okay. Follow-up question then. What do you think makes you yourself so good at product marketing and being a research analyst? What is something that you think is a key quality of yours that helps you evangelize solutions?
I love that question because I often get that when people say, "Oh, you're in marketing," or you do marketing. And I say, well, the reality is I didn't start in marketing. And I always tell people the best way to know that you have a good marketing team is for the people that really understand the market. At its core, that's what marketing really is. It's a derivative of knowing the trends and the changes. And so because I came from the consulting world and then go into the analyst world, I think that helps you become a better speaker to know what are those changes and how do you talk about them. And it goes to a lot of what I talk about with what I do now at Liberis is talking about the difference between positioning and messaging and understanding where you sit, who the competitors are, what those trends are, to be able to be effective at communicating to that prospective buyer. What is it that you do that's different? Because otherwise marketing then just becomes Google ads and white papers and, things that people try to digest. But if they don't understand the core of what that is, that can be very difficult. And then it just becomes noise.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we come to Liberis Consulting, one
Yeah,
more question
sure.
on one of my favorite topics, which is like solutions in the procurement supply chain space. So if I just look at the history of all the solutions you worked on, from supply chain visibility, risk compliance, spend management, source to pay, order to cash, digital payments, so many different solutions. So which one
Yeah.
would you say was your favorite and why?
I would say it's a hard question to answer because there's elements of each one that I find fascinating. Like spend analytics to me is still fascinating because it's the whole bringing all this data together. And we keep talking about data now with a lot of the elements of training these models in AI. That's certainly fascinating. CLM was a very fascinating one because of a lot of the things that we're seeing with how AI can help actually not only identify and monitor what's in clauses and libraries, but actually generate the contracts with this evolution. So that's one. But I think the last kind of entree in the supply chain risk space probably is the most interesting for me because of the background and what I studied in history and in my experience in studying international relations and understanding international trade. Those things, because of risk and understanding suppliers, that probably still remains to be the most fascinating to me because it brings the geopolitics and the economics and the procurement and the supply chain all in one place to know what's going on. So that probably is where most of my interest still focused.
It's pretty interesting. Good. I love that answer. So now coming to Liberis Consulting, which
Okay.
is the company you founded now, right? You're
Yeah.
looking to help companies building a solid foundation for positioning their solution effectively in a competitive market, which I think that's a great thing to aspire to because, yeah, markets are quite competitive, especially now that you can spin up new solutions so quickly with the help of AI. So when you look at a new solution and try to find the foundation that makes it different in the market, what are like the top three things you look for?
Well, I think the easiest way to answer that would be, an understanding how quick, if you go to a conference and you talk to their person that's representing, how quick can they turn around to pitch for me to truly understand what it is that they do? And when I find that there's this dissonance in that messaging, I find that as an ideal customer for me to talk to because what I try to do is to make sure the translation between what the founders had in mind and what they developed, the genius behind creating that software, putting that into a package, putting a name on it, and then saying, okay, salespeople, okay, marketing people, we need to try to sell this. I find that huge opportunity there in the transition there because what happens often is the things get lost in translation within an organization. And you need to make sure that you're able to properly enunciate what those value propositions are from the initial entree of what the founder had in mind. And it's exciting because you see some of these smaller startups, again, at one point, like for instance, with you guys, with you were Everstream, there's a starting point. There was something that was trying to be solved. We had to figure it out. Who's going to build that better mousetrap? So now the question is, are you solving that mousetrap problem better than someone else? Well, let me make sure I know how do you better enunciate that because there's different ways of solving similar problems, but what are you doing to do it differently? And too often, I think companies fail to really resonate in how they message that. And there's something in that translation piece that I talked about that gets lost. And that's what I'm trying to do, essentially.
Okay. So the founder's messaging is quite core. Is there anything else that you found that gets lost in translation quite a bit in when salesmen has tried to pitch to you?
I think it's because they don't truly understand the technology. It goes back to education. People pick up on buzzwords and then they really forget to have the discipline to go back and look at what those things really mean. I think AI is classic for this problem. People say AI this and AI that, and then they don't really go back and say, well, there's a lot of different ways that AI is being embodied in the market. And just saying AI is like saying, well, it's computing. Well, there's different things that you need to be aware of. And I think having a team, and I've written some blogs about this that I feel is so important, is educating your team on truly what that technology is, so that they're able, in very simplistic terms and layman's terms, be able to explain that in front of the board of the company or in front of the executive leadership to say, tell me what AI does and what does AI do for your company and your tech, and see where there's a disconnect. That will then definitely help, because then it helps put some reality to it. And it's not just using the buzzword to try to get in front of the competitor, right? I think that is so essential. And that's part of the reason why sales and marketing really need to have that discipline and not just doing the selling and the marketing. It's what's behind that, really truly understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually want to touch on the buzzword of AI as well. So again, a perfect segue. Unfortunately, I'm not the biggest fan of segues, but we'll take them.
Okay, sure.
So AI, you look at AI, emerging technologies in general. How do you think AI will develop for supply chains in 2025? Do you think it's already going to be the hype everybody expects, or is it going to start slower? What's happening with AI?
Well, the way I like to posit this is that, certainly from a planning and in forecasting, we've been talking about predictive for a long time when we're looking at things like machine learning and large language models, using that data to help us better understand those things. Those elements are there. I think they're only going to improve. And by the way, just with the stuff with quantum that just got released yesterday with Microsoft, it's going to blow our mind, right? But this whole thing, that this Pandora's box, I think, was really opened with the generative AI that a few years ago, because of the consumerization of the way people have been adopting technology so quickly, the ramp up is so vast. That is still taking time to take shape within enterprise solutions. So we're still trying to figure that out. What's legal, what's not, what's allowed within my organization? Do I use an outside platform to do this? Or do I use my internal data scientists to figure this out? And then the next thing is going to be this generative, collaborative, multi-enterprise, cross-functional AI. We're seeing this with this agentic AI of these workflows automating everything. I think this is what everyone's anticipating. That's going to still take time to take shape. But now that that's out there, people are talking about that. So I don't know. I think all these things are still taking shape. I think we're just going to have to figure out what element is going to take on the most ease of adoption that will make it then say, well, we actually have clients that do this. Because otherwise, it's just a lot of conversation that might be in pilots. And it's not truly a real part of the solution. It's just something people have to say to make sure they try to sell it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's kind of
buzzwords.
my view on it.
Yeah. Also, you have to see if your data is clean enough for AI anyway.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. For sure.
Good. I have another question, maybe, because one thing that I think makes you also stand out, given you were an analyst, you did product marketing for various companies, you actually have a lot of various relations in the analyst space as well, right? So you can also,
Yeah.
is that a thing that you think? Because if I think about some of my clients that I work with, right, who they know is often important in order to get a good reaction and fast reaction. Is that in marketing? Is that a similar thing, that it's not unimportant who you know and who you can talk to for certain things? And you know what, for example, works in terms of promotion, which webinars are successful? Is that something that you bring to the table that might help also these newer startups?
Yeah, absolutely. You know what tactic to take and how to communicate that tactic. But
Mm-hmm.
it always goes back to making sure you know who you are. Know thyself. This whole axiom that we know, that we learn in philosophy class or whatever. If you don't know that properly, then you can't then use those different channels. So certainly that's very important. Like, how are you going to want to talk to the analyst is going to be very different than how you sell. And how do you sell your customer, how you sell to a new customer, and how you enable the sales team to be able to sell, right? So all those are all pieces that I take into consideration when I work with a new client to try to make sure that that gets properly translated. And this is again something that it can't just be generated through, a chat GPT. It's like, oh yeah, I can just have it be created. I think what we need to realize is that the emotional intelligence of experience of the human is not replaceable, at least not anytime in our near lifetime. You need that emotional quotient to read the room, to be able to perceive, and then know how to then translate that properly to say, well, what tactic, how should we go about doing this? And certainly use the technologies and tools, but that's not going to replace that emotional quotient that I think that we need to all keep in mind.
Yeah, love that. So now you and with your company engage with a lot of different solution providers, and
Yeah.
you are a known figure in the space. That's why we have this podcast, frankly.
Yes.
So that also enables you to get a lot of different exposure to new technologies. So what are some of the newer technologies that you have seen recently that for you have a great growth potential because of their capabilities, and maybe you're following them closely right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an explosion in the, I see a huge development in your space, in the supply chain risk space. There's a lot of different combinations and permutations, I think, of these disciplines within supply chain and even within procurement and how they're working together. So there's this constant nuance of best of breed ecosystems working with the large enterprise systems. I try to track as much of that as I can. But I think it's the under element, it's the technologies now that are forcing how the providers out there are reacting to what they're going to do. Like one example of where I see this is, can we do this on our own? It's always the question, can I build it on my own better than use a technology that's out there, right? Is someone going to bring in a software that's packaged when you think that a big company can do this on their own? And I remember talking a lot about this when I was at the Hackett Group, right? The center of excellence, center led. We have all this research. We have all these resources. How are those dynamics changing what people are buying and why they're buying, and then understanding the cost structure? So, to answer your question on the technology side, I think AI is again the elephant in the room of what's driving everybody. Maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, quantum. I mean, this is a big, I don't think we've seen it yet embedded in any technology because it's so fresh, but I think we really have to keep our eye on that. I mean, the posting that I saw on LinkedIn with the CEO of Microsoft said this chip that they have that they were able to release is going to be more powerful than all the computers in the world. I'm like, that's just one chip. I think just blows your mind. I don't know how real that is, but when people are talking like that, it makes you think and scratch your head. So, but we have to keep our eye on it. We have to keep our pulse on it and see.
Yeah, perfect. So I have another question. We're coming a little bit to the end of the podcast, so I always
Okay.
like to ask a hobby question. So
Yes.
I would say you obviously a big fan of history and economics. We just have seen one of the most impactful events for supply chains, also impacting economics ever, with COVID. Okay.
Yeah.
So what would you say in the history of human mankind would be a similar intriguing event that might have impacted how we look at global trade? It's a complicated question.
That's a great question. Probably the biggest one that is, I would call modern history, which is anything after like late Middle Ages, is probably the Black Plague because of the transference. Because people don't realize this trade was going on between China and Europe. It existed since ancient times. And I think because of the transference of the disease that happened at different points in those trade routes, it got spread at different points. It went from China to the places like in Persia, then to Constantinople, which became a hub for the rest of Europe, to then, Italy and Germany and all these other places that were experiencing trade. And that shut down different points in time. And the depopulation, it forced people to change the way they had their business. People had to relearn things because a lot of the people that knew this stuff were dead. I mean, these types of things we don't think about, but we bring them fast forward. I think the difference is the pace at which these changes can happen now because of what the information that we have, the access to the technology, and the ability to react quicker. I always like to say in history, people had the same problems then as we do now. The difference is that the rapidity and the access to the information is so much quicker than you could back then. Same problems, just increased rate of change. I think that would probably be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, that was actually pretty good. Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, frankly. So love it. Okay, Constantine, that's essentially it for today. Before we end the show, I just want to say, everybody, I recommend going to Liberis Consulting, the homepage. Constantine has a great blog talking about things like how procure and supply chain tech startups can learn from McLaren's underdog victories. I think pretty insightful stuff. I recommend checking that out. They can follow you on LinkedIn as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ulf. I appreciate it.
Perfect. And with that, we want to say, as always, however you enjoy this podcast, no matter if it's listening, watching, I want to say bye-bye.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talks Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.